Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Lepetyuk, and we have here on the line, we have myself, we have Francis Waite and Lau Sharp from the South Carolina Forestry Commission Urban and Community Forestry Program, and we also have Nicole Heinbaugh from Bountiful Cities. If you guys don't mind, go ahead and type in the chat box if you can't see or hear us. Please let us know if you're having any technical difficulties. Lau Sharp will be able to help you. We're going to get going, but just in a couple minutes because we still have 2 minutes before we officially start. So if everyone can just hold on, we're all here, we're ready to go. Let's just give everyone a couple more minutes to log in. And let us know again if you're having any issues. Just one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Come on. Okay, it's 11 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. First of all, everyone, good morning. Thank you all for logging on. We appreciate you guys continuing to participate with these webinars. And as always, we appreciate your feedback. So without further ado, like I said, this webinar, we have myself, Chris Lepetyuk, we have Francis Waite and Lau Sharp from the South Carolina Forestry Commission. And come here, Sophia. And we are going to be talking about food forests and food security this morning. Before we get going, I hear you. Before we get going, we're going to first do some housekeeping. We do have two polls open. The polls are already open, so please go ahead and click into those. They ask you information about who you are, where you're working. Sofika, please wait. Where you're working. We also have a question and answer box. Please use that for content questions. Then we have a chat box. Please use that to say hello. Also, let us know if you're having any problems with the audio or visual. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Francis Waite, who's going to say a quick thank you.
I want to thank everybody for coming in and participating. We've got a lot of people that we usually see, and we've also got some new ones. And so please feel free to share this. We definitely want people to join in with us, but we appreciate you being here today. And let me look at the agenda here today. We have Nicole Heinbaugh speaking, and we're going to talk about what food forests are. She likes to call them edible parks, so I think that there's some different ways that we call them the same thing. And what roles do they play in a community? What are the barriers to the food forest implementation? And how have communities overcome these barriers? And some examples of food forests. And then I'm going to introduce myself. I think we have one more slide, Chris. Thanks.
Yep.
And so this webinar series is supported by a grant from the U.S. Forest Service to the South Carolina Forestry Commission Urban and Community Forestry Program. And so I'm Francis Waite. I'm the Urban and Community Forestry Coordinator. The program's mission is to help municipalities and counties build capacity in their own urban and community forestry programs. And we are partnering today with Plan Green to provide this webinar, and I want to welcome you all to the Planning Commissioner webinar series to give commissioners and advisory board members the tools to help you when you're having discussions regarding trees and urban forests. And we welcome our speaker today, Nicole Heinbaugh from the nonprofit Bountiful Cities, and we're really hoping to give you some ideas and concepts to consider in your decision-making processes.
Perfect. And my name is Chris Lepetyuk. I'm from Plan Green. And Plan Green works with all kinds of communities, small, medium, and large, urban and rural, on helping communities achieve their goals and to harness the value of green infrastructure. We believe that everyone has the right to live a healthy life and live in a healthy environment. And so that's what we do in order to achieve that mission. We are offering credits today. I think that most of you who have participated are pretty used to this, but um, we're offering the planning commissioners credits. We call them SCPEAC. We're also offering arborist credits and AICP credits. So SCPEAC, which is the planning commissioners credits, please just email me, as you all have been doing, so that you can tell me that you need the certificate. I'll go ahead and email you the certificate. If you need ISA credits, we do have a sign-in sheet that I will fill out. So again, just email me your ISA number, or you can chat me through the webinar if you don't want to have to deal with email later on. And AICP, there's a link to log your credits. So if you need that link, of course, I can provide it to you. Okay, so as everyone knows, this is the second webinar in this series. The first one we had was on environmental justice and urban forestry. We had two speakers come on and talk about what environmental justice is, how it presents, and what are some of the solutions associated with environmental justice and urban forestry. This next webinar today with Nicole Heinbaugh is about urban food forests and food security. So we're going to talk about what food forests are and how they can what are the benefits of them and how they benefit our communities. And then Nicole Heinbaugh actually has some specific expertise in how communities can start their own food forests, how they should be maintained. And so we're excited to hear what Nicole has to say. The last webinar in this year's series is going to be on October 13th. That's in about 6 weeks. I can go ahead and email at the end of the webinar. I'll email out a link so that everyone can go ahead and get registered for it. But we're going to have Dr. David Cohen. He's going to talk about invasive species, how they affect South Carolina urban forests and the ecosystem in general. He can also talk about some of the species, the native species that should go in a food forest. Okay, so I apologize that this is outdated. The ISA workshop has already passed, but we do have a webinar coming up on October 12th. That's the day before the second webinar in this series, the third webinar in this series. And it's going to be talking about the grants that the South Carolina Forestry Commission can provide for municipalities and counties. Please pass the information about this upcoming grant on to people in your municipality so that they can go ahead and get registered and learn about the urban forestry help that they can receive. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do kind of a prelude to Nicole's talk. So we're going to talk about what exactly are food forests. If you don't mind, click into the polls at this time and just say, what do you know about food forests before we even get going? So if you need to know about where that is, on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there's a button that says polls. Go ahead and click in there if you don't mind and just say, do you know a lot about them? Nothing about them? A little bit? So food forests are basically edible landscapes that are arranged to mimic a natural forest ecosystem. As everyone knows in here, a natural forest ecosystem has many layers. It's not just canopy trees. So we have canopy trees at the top. Then we have a low tree layer, such as small dwarf fruit trees. Then we have a shrub layer. Those can be berry bushes. Then we have an herbaceous layer. And then we're going to go even further. We're going to talk about what's under the surface. So first we have the soil surface. So what's growing down right at the ground? Do we have ground covers? Do we have some kind of turf cover? Then we have a root layer beneath that. So we can talk about root vegetables that can be growing there. And then finally, this is kind of like an all-encompassing layer, but that is the vertical layer. So the vines that can grow up. Are those espaliers or are those up various structures that are within the food forest? What is the benefit of a food forest? They are arranged so that they mimic a natural, healthy system. They require less pesticides. They can continuously make food for us with less inputs. And why are we talking about them in this webinar? You might be wondering. Because they follow on our theme that we introduced last webinar about environmental justice, so that they're well suited to urban and community forest conditions, and they serve to address meeting the needs of the community in terms of providing healthy food. What else do they do? So we're talking about the community. That's very good, but on these webinars, we want to talk about the ecosystem services as well. So because they do have a dense vegetation multi-layer system, and they have a root system that really penetrates the soil and really gets through and breaks up that what we know as can be really hard packed urban soil. They provide stormwater uptake and filtering. They allow those roots to really get deep into the system, and we can take up a lot of stormwater with those roots. In addition, we have pollinator habitat, and in there we have written design is important. So we have to be sure that we are not putting plants that we know that are going to be super pollinator plants right next to, for example, some kind of community spot where we know that people are going to be sitting very often, right? We have to be thinking about how can that space function. In addition, our food forests, our edible parks can provide shade, and they can mitigate the heat island effect. Finally, they provide species biodiversity and habitat. We can get more into that on the last webinar in this series when we talk about invasive species and how they impact our ecosystems. But they do, if we provide native fruit trees, native plants in our food forest, we can really provide habitat for the pollinators that we need. So we talked about ecosystem services. But what about people? So in here you see a statistic that the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs projects that by 2050, 68% of people will live in urban areas. So what's important about that is that as a species, we have been accustomed to nature. We have lived most of our evolutionary history living in tandem with nature. And now we know that most people, almost 70%, are going to live in urban areas. That means we have to start incorporating more nature into our urban areas so that we as people, we as a species can function at our optimal, which is how we've functioned in the past. So food forests are not just about ecosystem services, they're also about providing the things that people need, which is connection to the earth and connection to nature. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Nicole Heinbaugh, the program director at Bountiful Cities. If you'll give us just a minute so we can get the screen switched over. Nicole, there we go.
Hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me today. Just so that you know, as I'm sharing my screen, I can't actually see any of you or the chat. So I won't be able to keep track of questions that might be coming in that way. And hopefully one of our moderators can help us with that. Happy to be with you all. My name is Nicole Heinbaugh. I am a program director at Bountiful Cities. Bountiful Cities is an urban agriculture resource organization. We're a nonprofit organization located in Asheville, North Carolina, in Buncombe County. I've been here for just about 8 years, and Bountiful Cities has been operating since 2000, so a little over 20 years. And so we're going to move through what we have learned in our role as a sort of steward to many of Asheville's food forests. And so we're going to talk today about how some of the food forests came into being, how communities can work with these food forests, how we can partner with cities, with municipalities in order to create and also maintain food forests. Great, so let's go ahead and get started. So in Asheville, we call our food forests edible parks. So just to give you that heads up, I'm going to switch my language over to edible park simply because that's actually what all of the food forests are called technically here. And we're going to talk specifically about 4 different food forests in Asheville: the Dr. George Washington Carver Edible Park, the Tempe Avery Edible Park, the West Asheville Edible Park, and the Magnolia Edible Park. So the George Washington Carver Edible Park is really, it's the first known community food forest in the nation. It was planted in 1997. So there are over 40 varieties of fruit and nut trees there. We've got figs, apples, pears, chestnuts, hazelnuts, plums, peaches, grapes, and pawpaws, all native varieties. This is on public land owned by the city of Asheville. And in fact, all of the parks we're going to look at today are located on publicly owned land owned by the city. We've been managing the maintenance of that park since 2002. And so we're actually formally contracted with the city of Asheville to perform that maintenance. But it's important to note that that maintenance has not happened exclusively with Bountiful Cities. It's been performed in partnership with different kinds of organizations, both formal and informal. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in future slides. So here are some images from the Dr. George Washington Carver Edible Park. This is at the entrance. You can see here one of the projects that we've undertaken is to introduce high quality signage to all of the plants and trees located in the parks. That's been an important development because previously the signs were these really cute kind of hand painted wooden signs, but they deteriorated very, very quickly and became illegible. And so many people would walk through the park and not even realize that they were walking through a food forest. Another aspect of this park is that there is a community garden on site. Here you can see one of the mulched trails leading through the park, and that's one of the aspects of maintenance that we support as well as with trail maintenance. Here's an edible park workday. So the way that we perform maintenance with the park is through these monthly edible park workdays that we host. And then we ask volunteers to come out and support the different types of maintenance that are taking place at that time. Here you can see some muscadine grapes and some figs that have been harvested. So that is the George Washington Carver Edible Park. Tempe Avery is another edible park that we'll talk about. So they just underwent a pretty significant redevelopment at Tempe Avery. Back in this would have been 2016. We had a bond introduced. There was a bond referendum. And it was for, I think it was $75 million. And so approximately 20 or 25 million was allocated to parks services and parks and recreation. And so a number of our parks and playgrounds and places have been receiving some upgrades since that time. So Tempe Avery is located in the historic Montford neighborhood. And the food forest there, the edible park aspect of this location is a little bit newer. It doesn't have as many, it's not as old, obviously, as the Dr. George Washington Carver Edible Park, and so it's not as well established. But what we do have are mulberries and elderberries and pear trees and apple trees and all kinds of things like that. Less varieties than at the Edible Park, and they're also younger. You can kind of see that here through some of these photos. So as opposed to the George Washington Carver Edible Park, which really takes place in a forest, this is much more kind of trees planted in a park. So it's a different type of landscape, but it's one that's constantly developing and evolving. And I will just note too with Tempe Avery that most of the trees planted in this park were done by an informal community group called the Fruit and Nut Club, which is a group of just kind of guerrilla gardeners who came together who really care about fruit and nut trees. And so they had actually been maintaining the edible plants in this park themselves without any kind of contract or resourcing support before we began to more formally support the maintenance of this park just a year ago. The West Asheville Park is another location where it's not really in a forest in the same way that you would see the George Washington Carver Edible Park, and it's newer. So it is just developing. This edible park, the food forest aspect of it especially, is just developing. And one layer to that is the community garden, which has just been planted. It's just been installed and planted in 2022. So here you can see a lot of community members from the surrounding neighborhoods who have come out in support of these planting efforts, but also in planning. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too, different ways that communities can engage in these activities and in their local parks. So you can see here, again, this is more of a park-like setting as opposed to a forest-like setting. And then we have Magnolia Park. So Magnolia Park is much, much smaller. And it does have some pretty interesting varieties there, but far, far fewer than any of the other parks that we've talked about because it is a much smaller area. So in the middle of Magnolia Park is a playground, and then the edibles are planted sort of all around. And so there are, different kinds of fruit and nut trees there. There are some grapes and berries, things like that. But while some of the trees are more mature, the kind of total landscape is less abundant than some of the other parks. So let's talk about how do we know what kinds of plants and trees you might want to plant in your food forest or your edible park? One important factor is to know your zone. Now in North Carolina, where I am in North Carolina in the mountains, I'm in a different growing zone than what you all are in South Carolina. So while we're in Grow Zone 7, we're going to take a look in a minute so you can identify where you all are. It's also important to know your natives. And so one thing that I wanted to offer today is I've got linked in here, and I can make all of these slides available by PDF after the presentation so that you can click through any of these links because there are lots of additional resources included in here. They're all clickable links. So I just wanted to share this with you. This is the Master City of Asheville recommended species list updated in 2022. So this is something that the city has done with the Urban Forestry Commission, the UFC, in order to identify what kinds of species really are approved for planting, and they really focus on what is native. So you can see over here, they identify whether species are native. They also identify whether species are edible. And so lots of species here are not edible, but as you scroll down.
Hey, Nicole, I apologize for jumping in, but I don't think we see that screen. We see the what to grow plants and fruits screen.
Oh, you weren't able to, we didn't jump over to the, okay, that's interesting. All right, so let's see here. Let me see if I can figure out how to share in maybe a different way. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And now I'm going to reshare. And I'm going to try to do the window. No. That's interesting. See, it's not really letting me do that. It's just letting me share a tab. Yeah. Okay. Well, so unfortunately, I can click out and then I can click in to these links in order to share them. Here's the link that I was just showing you all before. Are you able to see this now?
Now we see.
Okay, great. All right, apologies for that. It's a little clunky with the share screen. Okay, so as I was saying, you can see here that within the trees that are listed, they have identified whether they're native varieties, whether they're pollinators, whether they're edibles, whether they're good for riparian plantings, the light requirements notes. So this is a handy thing, and I just wanted to share this with you. And of course, they have a list for shrubs as well. But I wanted to share this with you because as you're considering what kinds of trees to plant, having a list like this at the city or county level is very, very helpful. It's already been kind of pre-approved. So as I was saying, if you scroll down, you can see that there aren't, these are not all edible trees that are identified here and approved, but there are some trees here that are edibles. So like, for example, this is a chestnut that's been approved. Here's a persimmon that's been approved. And then and it keeps going. And then as you click over to shrubs, of course, there are a lot more that are available that are edibles. So service berries, chokeberries, et cetera, et cetera. So now I'm going to clunkily stop sharing and then share again and move back over to the presentation. Okay. Another thing that you want to think about is planting for a changing climate. So some of the things that we've had to be aware of are understanding where your floodplains are, even if they're areas that haven't seen flooding in a really long time. What we know is that the distribution of water is one of the significant things that's changing as a result of climate change. And so areas that have not received as much water and seen as much flooding are suddenly beginning to see more water. Areas that had less, more water previously are seeing less water. So really be aware of where the potentials are there for flooding and mindful of what kind of varieties to plant that can be responsive to that. Also thinking about changes in the growing zone. As things get generally warmer, the grow zone is actually shifting a little bit. So we're able to plant some things here in Asheville in the mountains of North Carolina, where of course we have Mount Mitchell, which is the highest peak on the eastern side of the Rockies. We're actually beginning to be able to plant things here that we've never really planted before. And so we're starting to experiment with varieties that aren't necessarily native because our native habitat is changing. And so that's one thing to be thinking about. And of course, as that changes, thinking about the heat tolerance of different kinds of plants. And of course, we already talked about planting in layers. So here's a grow zone chart. So you can see where you all are in South Carolina. That's grow zone 8. Where I am in North Carolina is grow zone 7. These are the layers that Christina was speaking of previously. So let's talk about some stakeholders, because certainly we Bountiful Cities are not acting alone in this work. And I'm not going to go through and click these links. As I said, I'm going to include all of these slides as a PDF for you all after the presentation, and you can go through and click these links. The links are just there for you to learn more about these different groups if you so choose. So the Fruit and Nut Club, really, I have to give the highest honor because for many years, they've been kind of going alone in the sphere of pushing for additional edible plantings in public spaces, guerrilla gardening style, just going in and planting trees, actually, planting shrubs, just going in and doing it, sort of act first, act for, rather than ask for forgiveness rather than permission sort of style of planting and maintaining those different trees. And honestly, what's happened is the city of Asheville has had a kind of slightly tense relationship with this group because they're on the one hand receiving free services. They are actually expertly planting and maintaining all of these edibles. And at the same time, they've not really been sanctioned to do so. They haven't really been contracted or commissioned to do so. And so occasionally there can be some tension between the groups, but the Fruit and Nut Club is really responsible for many, many, many of the park plantings that we have today. Asheville Greenworks is an organization. It's a 501c3 that specializes in tree canopy preservation and planting, and they serve on the Urban Forestry Commission. And so they also contract with the city of Asheville in various capacities. The Asheville Buncombe Food Policy Council has been a really key player here, because as we're going to look at in a future slide in just a moment, policy is really important when it comes to being able to implement and then provide ongoing maintenance and community involvement and support to edible parks or food forests. We've partnered directly with the city of Asheville's Office of Sustainability, and we partner more indirectly, actually, funny enough, with the City of Asheville's Parks and Rec Department, even though all of these food forests are located on Parks and Rec property. Neighborhood associations are really important to include in park design, in maintenance plan design, in work days, in events, in really building a sense of community and public use within these parks. It's important to get to know the neighborhood associations of the surrounding communities and work directly with them for advertising and other purposes. Community Garden Network is a network of community gardens that Bountiful City started. It's around 36 community gardens located in Asheville and Buncombe County. And so they have been really important partners to these edible parks as well. Some of them do have community gardens. Some of them don't, but they are still publicly available edibles. And so people who care about community gardens often also care about these food forests and want to be involved and want to support them. Of course, surrounding neighbors are really important to engage. The Urban Forestry Commission, I put in theory, would be an important key stakeholder here. Other than sort of developing that list of recommended plants, we haven't really had very much contact with the Urban Forestry Commission regarding these food forests. So they're an important player, but we haven't really partnered with them directly yet in this area. Same with the city arborist. The city arborist more so comes in when there's a kind of big issue at stake, like a redevelopment of a park. The city arborist will come in and sort of manage how the plants and trees are being kind of dealt with in the face of development, but they're not necessarily maintaining all of the plants and trees in these parks. That is actually being contracted with other stakeholders. And then we have an urban forester position. It's a brand new position that the city's created. And I have a link here I'm not going to go into right now, but you can click into it if it feels useful. They've started a job description for what that could look like. And so I've linked that job description here in case that's something that anybody is interested in looking into, potentially starting in their own area. So talking about community involvement in the edible parks, there are so many different ways that the community really can be involved, beginning with community input sessions. So we have found that a really helpful way to develop a sense of community ownership over these spaces is to host park maintenance plan input sessions where all of those kind of stakeholders who we just mentioned are invited, but really especially focusing in on the surrounding community of these parks. And inviting them to come in and say, okay, so let's think about not only what do we need to do in order to maintain this park in its current state and how people can be involved and when all these different activities should happen, but also what would the community like to see this park look like in the future? What should we be moving toward? Are we building in additional plantings? Is that something that is wanted? Is it wanted that this location actually could be a community gathering location? Do we need some sort of event space or pavilion, or what's useful here? What do people want to get out of their park? And let's plan that together. And that's a really great way for people to feel really involved and included in how these food forests and edible parks play out. Also, of course, community members can join an affiliated organization or community group. We just mentioned a bunch of those earlier. Attending community events. It's really helpful to host community events in the parks. People tend to come out more so to community events than work days. But there are also work days. And so really approaching maintenance from a community-based perspective as opposed to, you know, like maybe more of an arborist-based perspective, less so about having a single professional come in and maintain the plants and trees, more so about hosting a workday, a maintenance workday, where everyone, the public, is invited to come in and learn more about the park and participate in its care and its upkeep. Of course, community members can join boards and commissions that interface with these kinds of policies and properties. And they're just publicly accessible, right? So really anybody can come onto the park at any time, as long as it's before dark, and they can harvest. And the harvesting is open to all in the public parks. And one of the questions that we've gotten is, how is that regulated? What is to stop people from coming in and over harvesting? And to be honest, it's just not regulated that strongly because the city and its partners use a sort of escalating approach to regulation with this. So we start at the lowest possible end of regulation, just to make it as accessible as possible and not put too many rules and restrictions in place for folks accessing and using the park. And so what we do is we do have signage that we've been developing that says things like, only take what you can carry reasonably in your hands, or, be sure to leave enough for the rest. So sort of reminders for people to be mindful of their harvesting, but there isn't really anybody standing over these parks and watching what people take and then, rapping them on the knuckles if they take too much. Now, if it does become the case that is a problem in the future, then the policy and regulations will respond to that. They'll be responsive, but so far it hasn't been a problem, actually. And then another way that the community can be involved is in policy input. And I mentioned before that policy is really important. We're going to talk about that a little bit more on a future slide as well. So different ways to partner with the city or county. It's really important to know your departments and find your allies. So for example, the Office of Sustainability in the city of Asheville is our #1 ally right now. We contract with them directly. Offices of sustainability all over the country are different. They have different priorities. They focus on different things. Energy tends to be a big focus of offices of sustainability. Interestingly, food tends to not be as much of a primary focus for many of these offices of sustainability. And in fact, our previous director of sustainability at the city was a little less focused on food. And it wasn't until we got a new director who brought with her a type of prioritization for food and food security that we really began to be able to dig in to that partnership. So the individuals who are actually working at that level are super key to being able to proceed in a way that sort of opens doors for you. Parks and Rec is also super important. I mean, like I said, all the land that we see these edible parks take place it's on Parks and Rec land. And so that means that we have to coordinate with them. We have to coordinate with how they are maintaining the parks in general. We have to coordinate with them when it comes to needed supplies. When we need mulch, we coordinate with Parks and Rec. So really understanding who within the departments are going to be our allies in terms of prompt communications and ease of working really helps smooth things out. And then city council or county commissioners are also a really strong source of allies, because this is different from city to city, but in the city of Asheville, city council really sets the policy agenda, and then staff are responsible for implementing it. And so that means that if you can work with city council members in order to introduce a policy agenda in favor of increasing food security supports, like planting edibles on publicly owned spaces, then that means that right from the very top, you have that support in place. And then you have, after that, then you would have the support of the staff to kind of fall in line with implementing those policies. And so policy is your friend. And so one thing to look at when we think about policy is to take a look at what kind of policy barriers might be in place for you to be able to do what you want to do. And so I do have a link here. So I'm going to, again, apologies, it's clunky, but let's do this. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And then I'm going to click over here and start sharing again. I'm going to show you a UDO. It's called a Unified Development Ordinance. And let me find it here. Okay. So this is what our UDO database looks like for the city of Asheville. All of our public policies are here. All of the regulations are here for absolutely everything, actually. So sometimes this is located in a space called a platform called MuniCode. This is coming from a space called Code Library. But this is a really helpful tool. You can see here it talks about the Urban Forestry Commission, the powers and duties, downtown, all the different kinds of commissions. But it also really gets into development review procedures. It's hefty. This is hefty, right? So this is not super accessible to the general public, but one thing that's useful is it is searchable. So one thing that we do at the Food Policy Council is we actually search our UDO for different kinds of policy barriers to food security efforts, including growing food in public spaces. And then we introduce policy advocacy in order to shift some of those policies that might be presenting barriers to food security. That's the part of the work of the Food Policy Council. But another piece of the Food Policy Council is to work directly with the city, including city council and city staff, in order to develop what is called a food policy action plan. Now, the food policy action plan is hugely important for how we have been able to move through the process of having more plantings in public spaces, more edible plantings in public spaces, including the food forests. So to talk a little bit about the Food Policy Action Plan, I'm not going to click through the link here, but it is linked for you to be able to click through on your own time. I have an image down here in the corner of kind of what it looks like, but just to let you know a little bit about this and how it was created, because it really is the central mechanism that enables us to partner so closely with the city on these different activities. So it was developed in 2017. The city of Asheville owns it. They passed a resolution adopting it. The Food Policy Council was the primary partner in developing it. And then the Food Policy Council solicited input from many, many key partners in order to develop it. So we contracted with the city of Asheville. We, the Food Policy Council, contracted with the city of Asheville in order to gather community input and develop the plan itself. And we gathered community input from a whole variety of key partners, not just all the folks that we named previously, like the Fruit and Nut Club and Greenworks and anybody else who has a stake in food security work and efforts that are happening in our area, but also community input. So we did that in a variety of ways. We did it electronically through surveys. We did it in person through conversations. And we really wanted to know what is important to you all. What should the city focus on? If they're going to commit themselves to increasing food security, how should they do that? What should that look like? And so what came out about as a result of that is the Food Policy Action Plan. And because the city adopted it, they have now made this commitment. And because they have this set of commitments, it means that they have to implement these commitments in some kind of way. And that is directly what led us to being able to partner so closely with the Office of Sustainability, because they have primary oversight over implementing the Food Policy Action Plan. So it includes things like edible parks maintenance, community garden support, educational workshops, neighborhood emergency food preparedness, all kinds of different areas of the Food Policy Action Plan. So now we're going to shift into edible park maintenance a little bit, and there will be lots of time for questions as well. So just so you all know, I know this is a lot of information and we're covering a wide kind of range of topics here, but there will be opportunities for you all to ask questions in just a few minutes. So, edible park maintenance. As I mentioned before, Bountiful Cities does contract with the Office of Sustainability directly in order to support the organizing of edible park work days. That's how we go about this aspect of maintenance, is really to bring the community to the parks and work together on maintaining them. So this happens in coordination and collaboration, also with Parks and Rec, as I mentioned, and Fruit and Nut Club and neighborhood associations, all those groups that we talked about before. And then the city arborist really cares for the trees that are most impacted by development. So first, as I mentioned, a good first step is to develop a park maintenance plan with community input. So I'm going to show you all this link really quick because it's helpful maybe to see what a park maintenance plan can look like. So again, stop sharing. Okay, here we go. So this is an edible park maintenance plan. It consists here of a cover sheet that has all of the kind of at a glance information about the different parks that we support. It's got a quick cover sheet of primary contact people for each park. But then what we do is we go into a real plan for each park. So here's the Dr. George Washington Carver Edible Park. And so you can see here, broken out across the year, what are the various activities that need to take place, who are some additional relevant contacts, what are the future work goals related to community engagement and park development, what does the Bountiful Cities City of Asheville partnership need to look like in this area. And then we also have here a list of, it's an inventory basically, of all of the edible park plantings. And this is a very useful thing that we developed just really maybe last year. I think at the beginning of last year, we started to put this inventory together. And so we're able to use that not only to inform future work days and maintenance, but also so that we can create signage to install all over the parks. So this format is the way every one of these parks looks. This is how it follows the same format. So I'm going to pop out of here. And we're back. Okay. So what does this contract line item look like related to edible park maintenance? So it includes, as I mentioned, an inventory of the plants and obviously caring for the plants. It includes maintaining and updating the plans themselves. So we're kind of keeper of the plans. We also have been creating maps of the parks. So using that inventory, that species list, to say what is there, then we're also creating visual maps so that we can use them in kiosks at the parks for people to be able to get a sense of what is located where and not just have to kind of self-discover them by walking around and locating signage. And as far as how often those work days take place, some of them take place quarterly, some of them monthly, some of them bi-monthly. It depends on the park. Right now, the George Washington Carver Edible Park, because it's the oldest, it's the most well-established, it has the most trees and plantings, it needs the most work, the most care. Those work days are happening monthly. Some of the other ones like Tempe Avery, for example, it's much newer. It's got less community engagement so far. We're just kind of starting to dig into that partnership with the city in terms of supporting maintenance at that park. Those are taking place quarterly. So that's just examples of how those are laid out. So some challenges and learnings. Here's some of the things we've learned. We have learned that coordinating across departments within the city can be challenging. Oftentimes, departments exist in a kind of weird little silo where they're not actually aware of what other departments within the city are doing. There's strangely a kind of lack of interdepartmental communications that are taking place. And so if you're trying to coordinate across multiple departments, it's really important to leave enough time for slow communications and responses. That's one thing that we learned. And also, as I mentioned before, to make sure that you have a strong ally in the departments that you're trying to work with that is willing to communicate with you in a timely fashion. Also, community engagement strategies and success really does, those vary from neighborhood to neighborhood. If at first you don't succeed, try again. For example, with the George Washington Carver Edible Park, it's so well established that it's easy. It's super easy. We just partner with the neighborhood association. They have an electronic listserv that goes to every single household to remind people of when the work days are. I mean, it's great. Now, in Tempe Avery, located in the Montford community, there's much less established community involvement in that park. There's no really community involvement related to the neighborhood association. So it's all about building relationships. So first we have to build a relationship with that neighborhood association and try to access the neighborhood listserv and really build relationship with the folks who are located within that rec center as well, and the people who are managing that rec center, because so many people are coming there for the playground and the rec center and maybe don't even know about the edible aspect of that park. So it looks different. So you really have to be kind of creative about how you want to get community engaged in those spaces. It's really important to ensure that nonprofit partners are contracted at fair rates. I think sometimes occasionally cities might have an idea that, hey, if we partner with a nonprofit, it'll save us so much money because it's more expensive for us to have internal staff. And that might be true. That is probably true. But at the same time, nonprofits are composed of people who are trying to make a living also. And it's really important that they're contracted at a fair rate that enables them to pay their people. And does not create an undue and additional kind of burden or expense on the partner itself to try to draw down additional dollars to supplement the contracted rate in order to perform the services. It's really important to be aware of all the contractual reporting requirements. If this is speaking on behalf of a nonprofit partner and sort of speaking to prospective nonprofit partners, it's very important to be aware of all the contractual reporting requirements and be prepared for significant administrative burden. There is bureaucracy that comes with partnering with municipalities and counties. And so to get really, really clear on exactly what the paperwork is going to look like, how the I's need to be dotted and the T's need to be crossed. Also, we've learned that it's so important to advocate for community access and rights, even when other departments might be trying to squash some of those efforts. One of the challenges that we've run into is we have a pretty significant unhoused population in Asheville. And as you might imagine, edible parks and food forests are a kind of natural place for people to want to camp because they're green, they're filled with nature, and there's food on site. And so as an ally to all people who are seeking to increase their food security, we really want to ensure that there is access to everyone, regardless of their housing situation. And so we have had to enter into discussions and some advocacy with the police department, for example, with Parks and Rec, and with other folks. Another example of that is that there's a walking trail that goes through one of the parks, and there was lighting that was installed. And that lighting, in order to install the lighting, they actually cut down a bunch of the edible trees, like really mature fruit and nut trees were cut down in order to put in lights. And so again, it's one of those situations where we weren't in charge of that. We didn't have anything to do with that, but it was important for us to take up an advocacy position because it was actually decreasing food accessibility through the actions of one particular department. And then the last thing I'll mention here is to be aware of local guerrilla gardening efforts and collaborate wherever possible. And what do I mean by guerrilla gardening? Guerrilla gardening is when people just plant food. They just plant food wherever they can find places to plant food. And like I said before, they're not necessarily asking for permission. They're just getting food in the ground. And oftentimes these groups who are passionate about that and passionate about food access and increasing food security for all people are going to be some of your closest and most important allies. And you definitely don't want to step on toes if they've already been doing things like maintaining public parks for free, for example. And suddenly you have a contract. It's really important to bring in the people who are already engaged in this work. What's going on here? I'm not able to. There we go. So here's some other food forest examples and resources. I'm not going to click through these. These are resources for you all to take a look at as you wish. And here's some key takeaways. So collaboration is key. As we've said, there are lots of stakeholders to consider. Community engagement really should be performed at every stage, from the very beginning with planning all the way through ongoing maintenance and development. Policy is your friend. Take a look at what the policy barriers are, seek to address them with partners and allies if you can, and even look at creating new policy that supports the types of actions that you want to see taking place in your city. Find your allies in city and county departments. It will smooth the way and open doors for you to do what you want to do. And also find and partner with the experts, grassroots groups, organizations, individuals. Don't try to do it alone. And that's it. That's all I have for you. So my contact information is here as well. And as I said, I'll share this with everyone. And so if you all have questions after the event and you would like to get in touch, you're welcome to do that.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicole. We really appreciated how thorough that was. So much information there. I think that a lot of people wanted to see the links that you had. So if you don't mind sharing the slideshow with us, that'd be great. We could email it out to all the participants. What we want to do now is we have about 5 minutes. If anyone has any questions for Nicole, we can go ahead and take those. She does have another meeting after this, so we won't be able to stay after, but we do have 5 minutes. Okay. There's one question that did come in about fruit trees, especially in a coastal zone. And I think that was Marla Jean that had that question. We did pop a couple of links in under that question in the Ask a Question section. And we did say to definitely attend the next webinar because you can directly ask an expert about coastal trees.
Chris, I do see a question here that says, do the food insecure population have easy access to these food parks? So I'm happy to go ahead and answer that if that's okay.
Yeah.
So food insecure populations are all over the city and county. Obviously, we have food deserts. That language is actually even shifting where I live. They're actually calling those locations areas of food apartheid, which is a whole other discussion. But typically, these are low wealth neighborhoods, historically neighborhoods of color. So most of the edible parks that we took a look at today are actually located within these historically vulnerable and socially marginalized communities. So the George Washington Carver Edible Park, for example, is located in the East End community, which is a legacy neighborhood. It's a historic African-American community. And so it's super accessible in that kind of way. Also, the parks are accessible to all public all the time. So if people are able to get to the parks, they can access them. Public transportation is key there. For people who are experiencing food insecurity, sometimes there's also a co-occurring need for transportation. And so all of these parks are accessible by public transportation. And that's also something to think about as you're thinking about planning a food forest or a publicly edible park.
That's great. It sounds like the key there is to locate them in the community that needs the edible park.
Yes, ideally, and secondarily, make sure that they're located on public transportation.
Super. We have one more question that came in from Eric Schultz. He said, "What is the policy on the use of pesticides and herbicides in the food forest?" Good question, Eric.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So the city of Asheville has adopted the policy that they do not use pesticides and herbicides on any of their city-owned spaces, including the edibles. And of course, Bountiful Cities also does not. That is inherent to our policy as well. So I know different cities and counties are in different places with maybe how progressive they are in terms of that type of policy. But again, this is why policy is your friend, because even if the policy does not reflect the most progressive stance, it can be the work of the people, of public, of community groups, of organizations and allies in order to make that policy change take place.
Excellent. It looks like we have one more. It sounds like Asheville is really a forerunner in this space. Was it hard to get leadership support for these efforts?
So this is where finding your key allies early on is so crucial. From the very beginning of even the development of the Food Policy Council back in 2011, we had a key city council member who actually helped to start the Food Policy Council and then championed food security efforts at the city level from that time on. So by having key allies in very specific places of power and authority, we were able to really smooth the way for those kinds of partnerships. But it took time and it took relationship building. So not every member of power and authority has been always in favor of this, but by having champions and kind of key roles and kind of key gatekeeping positions, it helps to smooth the way. And it's true, Asheville is just typically more of a kind of progressive city, and so it has been maybe easier to find receptivity here than in some other places.
Super. Well, I think that's all the questions. I think everyone is really appreciative of Nicole and all the information. And yeah, we thank you, Nicole. And if you guys need certificates, if you need credits, please do email me. Let me pop my email in the chat real quick just to make sure everybody has it. Um, Perfect. And Anne just said this is a wonderful webinar. Sandra said wonderful information. So we really appreciate your time, Nicole. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so
Thanks.
much.